Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. We are united in detesting communist slavery. We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost.
The Japanese had occupied the Korean Peninsula for many years, and after World War II, and they were defeated, like in other locations you can think of, the peninsula was divided in parts, with the Soviet Union occupying the north and administering it, and the Americans and other UN forces eventually occupying the south until a new government could be agreed upon. They couldn't agree because in the north, the communists wanted control not just of the north, but of the entire peninsula. Elections were held in the South in 1948 and created a democratic society, and at that point, American troops withdrew because they were no longer needed. The Koreans had a state there of their own. So this was a situation 2 years later when the North Koreans surprise attacked the South. The surprise attack was a mass attack with large numbers of ground forces and tanks, but also an air force that the Soviets had trained and equipped for the North Koreans. It was relatively small in number, but without a South Korean air force and without any Allied major presence, it was still very potent. And very early on in the war, the South Koreans approached the Americans specifically and the UN generally to say, we need air power, we need aircraft, we need to be able to defend ourselves. And it wasn't feasible to give them aircraft to operate on their own, and they weren't trained in using them. And so very early on, the American ambassador to South Korea reported back, they need immediate air power, and the course of the war in general will be determined by the presence or absence of American air power.
I am proud to report that the United States is prepared to furnish assistance to the Republic of Korea.
The Korean people had been under such duress with the Japanese, number one, and when the North Koreans came in, they treated them just as badly. They were so glad to see us. We were their rescuers.
Last-minute evacuation by air is necessary.
Many of the Air Force operations in the early phase were primarily air evacuation. As the front line pushed south, it went right past Seoul, the capital, and so there was a need to evacuate American and other civilians, which they did very successfully. The other major role for the U.S. Air Force from the opening phase was to apply as much air interdiction as they could in order to starve the attacking forces of resources. This was limited at the beginning, but increasingly effective as time went on, and in fact proved vital because the scale and speed and surprise of the attack made for a very potent offensive, and the North Korean forces rolled down the peninsula almost all the way to the end. At the height of their wave, there was just a pocket in the southeast of the peninsula, the Pusan perimeter, that the South Koreans and Americans and Allied forces were trapped in. If it had not been for air power and air interdiction, that pocket might have collapsed and the war could have been won in its opening phase. While that was happening, planning was already underway for a counterattack.
The UN forces take the offensive. An assault fleet appears off Walmy Island at Incheon Harbor.
And that came eventually led by General MacArthur at Incheon, a major amphibious landing that created a pocket behind enemy lines and eventually was able to spread into a counteroffensive that rolled the North Koreans up all the way past the 38th parallel and increasingly all the way up towards China. The closer American and Allied forces got to the Yalu River, which is the border between China and North Korea, the closer that we got to that border, the more China warned that crossing that river would mean them entering the war in force.
It started out smoothly, but by nightfall of the second day, the UN was facing a new enemy in Korea. and a new war had begun.
China was not going to wait for a mass invasion. They invaded themselves with large numbers of troops and tanks. And that Chinese offensive then was the second major turning point of the war, opening up a third phase in which a Chinese-led offensive drove towards the south. And this also saw the appearance and increasing frequency of Russian MiGs, which were an incredibly effective jet fighter and a major threat in their own right. But fortunately, the United States Air Force already had a new, more advanced jet fighter in the development pipeline, and that's the F-86 Sabre.
We had F-86s and P-51s. Each flight had their own job, and the F-86s were escorts for B-29s heading north.
It was designed as a fighter interceptor or also a fighter bomber, and it played both of those roles very well in the Korean War. It was not the equal of the MiG-15, but enough of its equal that the skilled American pilots could take advantage of that, and had an incredible air-to-air ratio over the course of the war. Many of the pilots in the Korean War had been pilots in World War II. Gabi Gabrewski was a Polish-American from Pennsylvania. Robbie Reisner, who went on to be one of the leaders of the American POWs in the camps in Vietnam. And then James Jabara, who was the first American jet ace. And then as far as aerial victory goes, they shot down 780-some MiGs in exchange for only 70-some losses. That's a 10-to-1 ratio. The Korean War was known as a limited war. It was still incredibly destructive in the areas that were being fought over, and particularly in North Korea, where the majority of the fighting over the whole war took place. In both North and South, there were a lot of attacks against factories, railroad facilities, rail yards, bridges. The whole infrastructure came under attack.
Oh, well, it was terrible. I mean, things were just completely blown up. Everything was. Well, the only ones that were left were the ones that were made out of concrete and blocks like that. Any of those hooshes that they call them, they were just paper shacks. They got blown away. So those people had no place to live in wintertime. They really had it tough.
So the final phase of the war actually lasted the longest. After the Chinese attack was stopped, there was a bit of a seesaw campaign, counter-campaign, but fighting eventually stabilized around the 38th parallel. And after several years of that, it became clear that neither side could achieve full victory. The political negotiations continued and eventually settled on a ceasefire with a line of demarcation right at the 38th parallel where this had all started in the first place. That ceasefire technically persists today, and the war is what we call a frozen conflict, meaning that it is not technically over, but it is also not being actively fought.
Well, it's difficult to think about over 36,000 of our troops died in Korea. Over 9,700 were wounded in Korea. So we bled for Korea to help the Korean people. We tried our best to make their life a lot better. And when we go back now to visit them, or they come to the United States to visit us, they are so glad for what we did for them when we were there.
If you're talking about the importance of the Korean War, all you need to do is look at a simple picture. If you see an image of the Korean Peninsula at night, South Korea almost looks like an island. You can see the illumination of its cities and its vibrant society just lighting up the night. And then to the north of that, it's just darkness until you get to China. That's the society that all of Korea could have been living under for generations if it weren't for the UN and American successes in the Korean War.